The auctioneer was already on the second round of bidding when the woman at the back of the lot stopped looking up. It was August 1959, outside Enid, Oklahoma, on a wheat farm that sat 6 miles off State Highway 81 on a dirt road that turned to red mud every spring. The kind of place where the mailbox post had been repaired with baling wire twice, and nobody had ever thought to replace. Consolidated Grain Holdings, a combine operation out of Tulsa with 17 acquisitions in 3 years, had filed the foreclosure notice in May. Their man, a Mr. Gerald Pratt, stood at the front of the lot in a tan summer suit and held a clipboard. He had done this before. He held the clipboard the way a man holds something he does not need to. The crowd was 30 people, mostly neighboring farmers and 2 reporters from the Enid Morning News. Nobody was bidding against Consolidated. Nobody had the money to. Ada Lester stood at her own windmill with her hands at her sides and watched them auction off the farm she and her husband Carl had built for 29 years. Carl Lester had gone down in the East Field in the summer of 1956 with a fencing pliers still in his hand. Ada had kept the mortgage payments through 56 through 57, and most of 58 before the drought hit and the bank revised its terms in a letter so polite it took her a second reading to understand what it said. 29 years. The auctioneer called out 8,000 once. The frozen crowd looked at their boots. One of the reporters wrote, in the far corner of the lot, leaning against the hood of a dusty Ford pickup, a large man in a canvas work shirt and a tan Stetson with trail dust on the brim was watching. He had come off a location scout near Woodward that morning, heading south, and had stopped at a gas station in Enid, where the attendant mentioned there was a foreclosure auction up the road. He had not planned to stop. He stopped anyway. He was watching Ada Lester's hands. Here is the story. Ada Lester had come to that farm at 19 years old with Carl, who had driven them west from Muskogee in a truck with a cracked engine block he'd repaired himself with a piece of shim steel and a prayer. They had farmed wheat. Winter wheat. The long way. The patient way. Carl had built the barn in sections over Ada had kept the books and planted the kitchen garden and learned to drive the combine the summer Carl broke his wrist and couldn't. When their son Robert shipped out in 1951 Korea, 7th Infantry Division, the long winter at Chipyongni Ada had put the calendar on the wall and marked off the months until he came home. Robert, he came home walking different than he had left, and with one hand that had lost 2 fingers to frostbite, and he had gone to work at a wire factory in Enid because the farm couldn't carry 3 adults through the lean years. Carl's stroke had left Ada alone on 640 acres. She had hired 2 hands part-time and kept going. She had sold the second truck to make the October payment in She had sold her mother's sideboard to make the payment in February of 1958. When the drought cut the harvest by 60% that fall, the bank sent Mr. Harlan Webb, their agricultural lending officer, out to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon. Webb had driven a clean car and left his hat on when he came inside. He had set the new repayment terms on her kitchen table, with a pen already laid beside them, and had said, and these were his exact words, "Mrs. Lester, I think we both know this is the best we can do for you." She had not signed that day. She had called Robert, who came out from Enid and read the terms and looked at the numbers and could not find a different answer in them. She had signed in March. By May, Consolidated Grain Holdings had filed. By August, Gerald Pratt was standing at the front of her lot with a clipboard. He called it a distressed opportunity. His words. He used them the way a man uses words he has used in other lots on other Tuesdays. The auctioneer called 8,000 once. He called 8,000 twice. One of the neighboring farmers, a man named Del Sooner, who had bought seed from Carl Lester for 15 years, looked at the ground between his boots for a long moment and then looked away. The reporters didn't write anything. If you've ever stood in a room where something wrong was happening and felt your hands go completely useless, drop a comment below. Drop your state. I want to know how far this story reaches. The auctioneer drew the breath that comes before the final call. The man in the canvas work shirt pushed himself off the hood of the Ford pickup. He did it slow, without urgency. The way a man moves when the decision has already been made and the only thing left is to walk it over to where it needs to be. He crossed the lot the way he walked across every set he had ever worked on, like the ground belonged to him, and he was in no particular hurry. The crowd parted for him the way crowds do for a man of that size moving with that much certainty, and most of them still hadn't placed the face when he stopped beside Gerald Pratt and turned to look at the auctioneer. "Hold it," he said. 2 words. He didn't say them loud. The auctioneer held it. Gerald Pratt looked at the man. Something moved across Pratt's face that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite confusion. He opened his mouth. "What's the number?" the man said, and this time it wasn't a question. Pratt looked at his clipboard. "Current bid is 8,000. Consolidated's position is firm at what's the number to close it." Pratt looked at the outstanding balance with penalties and legal fees is $11,400. The man in the canvas shirt reached into the interior pocket of his jacket. He produced a bank envelope. He counted it out on the hood of Pratt's company sedan, counted it in cash, in deliberate stacks, while the crowd went so quiet you could hear the windmill turning. 11,400. He counted it twice. He set it flat on the hood of the sedan and put one hand on top of it and looked at Gerald Pratt. "Draw up the deed," he said. "Put Ada Lester's name on it." Pratt looked at the envelope. He looked at the man. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Very carefully, mister. I'm not sure what this is about, but consolidated has already been paid," the man said, "with penalties and legal fees." He left his hand on the envelope. "Draw up the deed. Some things, once said, don't need to be said again." Gerald Pratt drew up the deed. He used the hood of his own sedan to write it out. He didn't look up while he did it. The reporters were writing now. When it was done, the man carried it himself across the lot to where Ada Lester was still standing. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. Her face had the particular stillness of a person who has spent 3 years getting used to the idea that something is over and cannot yet locate the feeling that it isn't. "I don't understand," she said. "Mister, I can't ever." "Carl Lester sold wheat to half the farms in this county for 30 years, the man said. "That's 30 years of putting food on tables. I owe that man a debt, and he is not here to collect it. You are. This is back pay. That is all this is." He touched the brim of his hat. He walked back to the Ford pickup. He drove south on the highway toward Woodward and did not look back. Ada Lester read the deed. She read it again. Del Sooner, the neighbor who had looked at his boots, walked over and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. After a while, she folded the deed carefully and put it inside her coat. One of the reporters walked over. She looked at him and shook her head. Ada Lester farmed that land for 19 more years. She learned the windmill, the whole greasy top of it in the August wind. She learned to read the winter wheat the way Carl had read it, by touch and by the color the horizon goes before a hard frost. In 1961, Robert came back from the wire factory and came back to the farm, and his one remaining hand turned out to know more about machinery than 2 whole hands that had never tried. In 1963, Ada added 40 acres from a neighboring plot that came up for sale at a price she could make work. By 1965, the farm was running clean, and the bank debt was closed, and the papers were in a box under the kitchen floorboard where Carl had always kept important things. She died in 1978. She died on the farm, in the same house where the box under the kitchen floorboard held the important things. Robert Lester, who had stood in a ditch in Korea in November of 1950 and found out what cold, who had come home with a hand that would never close properly again, who had spent 7 years at a wire factory before he came back to the wheat. Robert Lester farmed that land until 2001. 42 years counting from the morning his mother walked back to the farmhouse with a deed folded inside her coat. He had a daughter, Carla Lester. Grew up on those 640 acres. She learned to drive the combine when she was 12. She went to Oklahoma State on a partial scholarship in 1979 and got a degree in agricultural science. She came back. She is the one who told this story, finally, in an interview with the Oklahoma Historical Society in 2004, because she had heard it from her father, who had heard it, and she thought someone should write it down before the people who were there were all gone. She kept the deed framed on the kitchen wall, the original one with Ada's name written in Gerald Pratt's careful hand on the hood of a company sedan. She also kept, in a coffee can in the barn, a single fencing plier, the one her grandmother had told her was still in Carl Lester's hand the day he went down in the... Robert had found it when they cleared that section in 1957, and had kept it without saying why. On certain afternoons in late summer, when the light comes through the west window at the angle it does in August, the frame catches it, and the paper goes a particular gold. Carla said it looked like something that was still warm. John Wayne never, not the crew that drove the location scout truck back to Woodward. Not the director he was working with that fall. Not in a press interview. Not in a radio appearance. Not in any letter anybody ever found. The reporters from the Enid Morning News wrote a brief item, "Movie actor intervenes," at foreclosure auction, but they hadn't placed the name in time, and the story ran without a byline on the... It was 3 sentences. It was in no syndicate. What Ada Lester knew, and what Robert Lester knew, and what Carla Lester carried forward was that a man stopped when he did not have to. That he crossed a lot in August heat and put his hand on an envelope and said, "This is back pay," when it was nothing of the kind. When it was the oldest and rarest thing, which is one person deciding that someone else's 29 years mattered. He noticed people. The ones that most rooms had already decided not to see. That is all this is. That is the whole story. If that reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them deserves to be told. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.